Story 1. Fallen Tree. A few years back, I went to visit my parents who live up in the mountains. We'd spent the day catching up, talking about work, and about life in general. As I typically do, I dodged the expected questions about the fact that I was still single and had no prospects on the horizon. Aware of their advancing years, I try to get away to see them at least every few months, and try to cherish each moment that I'm able to spend with them. As evening turned into night, a storm began brewing. The wind began to pick up sharply, and lightning-illuminated clouds could be seen making their way in from the distance. It had already gotten dark, and I figured it was time to head out before things got too crazy. I said my goodbyes and hit the road. The path down the mountain, one I'd traveled hundreds of times, suddenly felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. Maybe it was the brewing storm, the way the lightning painted the sky in flashes of eerie light, or perhaps it was something else. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake this deep, unsettling feeling of unease that clung to me, as heavy as the rain that began to beat down on my car. In mere seconds, the calm of the night was shattered as a gentle drizzle escalated into a torrential downpour, transforming the world outside my car into a blurred, chaotic rainstorm. It was almost impossible to see, and my old, worn wipers were nearly useless against the pounding rain. I drove slowly, inching forward in my seat, straining toward the windshield in an effort to enhance my visibility, as my headlights struggled vainly to cut through the relentless veil of rain. As I made my way down a short straightaway, I could barely make out something sprawled across the road in the distance. Upon approach, my heart skipped a beat, and I brought my car to a halt. Ahead, there was a tree down, probably knocked over by the wind, blocking the other lane and partially covering mine. It was hard to tell if I had enough room to get by without scratching up my car. I sat there for a moment, contemplating my options. The road was too tight for a U-turn, but I also didn't want to try to swerve around too much to miss the tree and risk tumbling down the side of the mountain. I figured I needed a better look to decide on my next move. So I planned to dash out of the car quickly, check out how much space I had to maneuver around the tree in my lane, and then figure out if it was safe enough to try and pass it. With a deep breath, I stepped out into the rain and was immediately soaked to the bone. But that urgency soon turned to an unnerving dread. There was something off. Again I felt it. Something wasn't right. Nevertheless, I swung around my door and took about 4 steps before a chilling realization struck me. The tree hadn't fallen. It had been cut, deliberately, cleanly through. I could see near the base of the trunk where someone had deliberately cut it. Panic surged through me, and my eyes darted to the woods. I wasn't alone. There was someone else here, and I felt like I had just walked into a trap. I began to back up, never taking my eyes off of the woods. But then, on my second step, I saw him. I could barely make out through the pounding rain a dark figure emerging from behind a tree. Our eyes locked, and in that instant, he lunged out and began sprinting straight for me. My heart plummeted into my stomach, and I dashed back around to my car door, diving into the seat. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as he reached for the handle, yanking at it violently before starting to bang on my window. Panic-stricken, I shoved the car into drive and hit the gas, plowing through the portion of the tree blocking my lane. I could hear the sound of branches scraping and tearing at the side of my car as I pushed forward, everything in me focused on not veering off the mountain road. I drove like a man possessed, terrified at what had just unfolded. It wasn't until I reached the safer, broader roads of the valley that I allowed myself to breathe and called the authorities. Eventually the storm abated, and the authorities were able to make their way out to investigate the scene. They confirmed that the tree had been intentionally cut down to block the road. As for the terrifying figure who had charged at my car, aside from a set of footprints left behind in the mud, there was no trace of him. He was never found. It's chilling to think about what that person's intentions might have been. Was I going to be robbed, carjacked, or something even worse? Despite the ordeal, I refused to let the incident deter me from visiting my parents. Yet, every time I pass that particular location, memories of that dark, rainy night flood back. Now, whenever I drive past that spot, especially alone in the dead of night, I find myself on high alert, and I ponder what could have happened to me if I didn't make it back into my car that night. Story 2. Seeing Red and Blue. In the southwest corner of Missouri lies the city of Joplin. It's more than just a place on a map to me. It's where I was born, where I was raised, and where I grew up. Joplin, for all its familiarity and warmth, was the only place I really knew until I met my wife. She lived in a small town about 35 minutes outside of the city. After we got married, we decided to settle there because it struck a balance. We were close enough to Joplin that we could dip our toes into the hustle and bustle whenever we wished, reconnecting with old friends and revisiting family. Yet we were far enough away to enjoy the tranquility and simplicity of rural living, where every day ends with a quiet, starlit sky. On one particular night, we were visiting my lifelong friend John and his wife Mary. John and I go way back to middle school, and over the years, Mary has become just as close to my wife as John is to me. They have a cozy place right in the heart of Joplin, and visiting them always feels like coming home. We were only supposed to be there for a few hours, but with John, plans have a way of extending themselves. Before we knew it, we were deep into stories, card games, and laughter. When I finally looked up for a moment, it was almost 1 a.m. Time has a way of sprinting past you when you're caught up in the warmth of friendships that have weathered years. Our friends, bless them, offered us a place to crash, but home was calling our names. It was only a 35-minute drive after all. The drive started like any other, with the familiar glow of Joplin fading behind us as we ventured onto the less forgiving darkness of the 2-lane highway that connected us to our small town. About 20 minutes into the drive, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, distant at first, but closing in at an alarming rate. Before I could even voice my concern to my wife, those lights transformed, revealing the unmistakable flash of red and blue. A cop? What the hell? I was certain I wasn't speeding, yet the sinking feeling in my gut suggested something wasn't right. The vehicle, what appeared to be a red SUV, was an odd choice for a patrol car, and it loomed ominously in our rear view. There was no siren, just the silent flashing lights, which were oddly mounted on the inside and not the top of the vehicle. My wife, sensing my hesitation, was feeling the same thing that I was. Something was incredibly off. Instead of immediately pulling over, I flicked on my hazards to signal that I was aware of the situation. I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't trying to flee or ignore the flashing lights behind me, but I also couldn't shake this deep-seated feeling of discomfort about stopping right there and then. The road we were on was deserted, and we were out in the middle of nowhere. We hadn't seen another car since we'd left Joplin's city limits, and now, surrounded by nothing but open land, pulling over felt more like an invitation to trouble than a routine check. This move, however, didn't seem to sit well with the driver of the SUV. Almost immediately, they began flashing their high beams at us, cutting through the darkness with an aggressive, blinding light. It was like they were trying to communicate their impatience or maybe intimidate us into stopping faster. Then, to add to the tension, they started to accelerate, closing the gap between our vehicles with a speed that felt both deliberate and threatening. But just as quickly as they'd surged forward, they eased off the gas, maintaining a close but steady distance. It was a clear message. They weren't going anywhere, and they wanted us to stop. Finally, weighing the situation with a heavy sense of unease, I decided it was time to pull over. But I was firm on one thing. I wasn't going to lower my window or unlock the car. Safety first, always. I turned to my wife, her face mirroring my concern, and told her to dial 911. The plan was to confirm whether there had actually been a call reported about us being pulled over, and if not, we needed to have someone dispatched to our location immediately. Upon pulling over, the man from the SUV wasted no time. Immediately, he shone a flashlight into my rearview mirror, an intense beam that splintered the night's darkness, blinding me effectively. The light was so overpowering that I couldn't make out any details about him, turning him into just a shadowy figure with a beam of light. As he approached, the beam of his flashlight shifted from the mirror directly to my side, now aiming through the driver's side window and into my face, further obscuring his features and intentions. The harsh white light felt like a physical force, pressing against my eyes, forcing me to squint and look away. Then came his voice, a deep and aggressive tone cutting through the silence of the night. "Roll your window down," he demanded, his words carrying an edge that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Despite the authority in his voice, the situation felt all wrong, heightening the tension that was already pulsing like a live wire through the air. Refusing to lower my window, I found my voice, demanding his credentials. The standoff, punctuated by his increasingly irate demands and the unyielding barrier of my car window, felt like a scene plucked from a nightmare. My wife was already on the phone with 911, detailing our location and the unfolding events, with an urgency that matched the rapid pounding of my heart. After a bit of back and forth, with the tension thickening between the stranger and me, I could feel the moment teetering on the edge of something uncontrollable. This man, whoever he was persistent, but something deep in my gut screamed that this wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. Finally, gathering my resolve, I addressed the shadowy figure on the other side of the light. My voice was steady, more than I felt, as I said, "My wife is on the phone with 911 right now. Once a police officer shows up, I'll be happy to lower my window for that officer." The words hung in the air between us, a clear line drawn in the sand. I was standing my ground, and we weren't going to do anything until a legit police officer arrived. The man's response was instant. There was no argument, no further attempt to coerce or demand. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked back to his SUV with a purpose that was almost alarming in its intensity. His movements were swift, deliberate, suggesting that this was a situation he wanted to escape from as quickly as possible. Even before he fully shut his door, all the lights on his SUV went out. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart skip, he backed up, executed a swift U-turn, and peeled out, tires screeching against the pavement as he vanished into the night. The abruptness of his departure, after such a tense confrontation, left an eerie stillness in its wake, a stark contrast to the high-pitched drama of just moments before. After the strange SUV sped off into the night, it wasn't long before a real officer arrived at our location. The interaction with this officer was starkly different, professional, clear, and reassuring. We explained the situation, our voices still trembling from the adrenaline. The officer took our statements with a grave nod, understanding the severity of what could have been. After a bit of conversation, and ensuring that we were all right to continue, we were released to head home. I never did find out what became of the man in the SUV, or if anyone was ever caught for impersonating an officer that night. But in the end, I'm just grateful. Grateful that my wife and I trusted our instincts. Grateful for the genuine officers who protect and serve, and grateful that we made it home safely. Story 3. I was being followed. Back when I was in my mid-20s, I was coming back home from a trip. It was a long 6-hour drive, but one I had made many times before. Along the way, there was an accident on the road that held me up for hours. By the time it was finally cleared, it was already around 10 p.m., and I had about 3 hours left to drive. I was still very much awake and tight on money, so instead of pulling over to find a place to sleep, I decided to tough it out and drive the remaining few hours to get home. And so, that's what I did. About 30 minutes after passing the accident, I noticed a car had been following me. Initially, I didn't give it much thought. It was late, and I assumed it was simply another traveler heading to their destination, just like I was. But minutes turned into hours, and that car, it just wouldn't let up. It was like a shadow, always there, making me more and more uncomfortable. The unease was gnawing at me, so, in an attempt to shake it off, I slowed down, hoping it'd zip by. But it didn't. Instead, it slowed down when I slowed down, and it sped up when I sped up. Finally, I figured I needed to grab something to eat. I figured I'd pull off and the car would go about its way. But it didn't. As I exited the gas station, I could see that the car was there, parked across the street. Trying to keep it together, I told myself that they were probably lost, or needed to check their directions or something. But deep down, I think it was just me, trying to avoid the truth that I was being followed. As I pulled out, sure enough, the car pulled right behind me again. At that point, I should have called the police or something, but I didn't. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that it was only coincidence that the car was going in the same direction that I was. For another hour I drove, the headlights directly behind me. Needing to stop to use the restroom at that point, I drove to the next available exit and pulled into a rest stop. Once again, the car followed me. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. This wasn't right. This wasn't just coincidence anymore. I couldn't take it anymore. I drove as fast as I could, almost 20 miles over the speed limit, almost hoping that I'd either get pulled over or see the lights of this mysterious car trail off into the distance. Unfortunately for me, neither happened. When I got within reach of my hometown, I called my parents, voice shaking, telling them what's happening. In a serious tone, my father told me to head downtown and make 4 immediate left turns. It was a test to see if the car was truly following me. Like a bad dream, that car followed me at every turn, relentless, like it was locked onto me. Then, in the midst of my panic, my parents threw me a lifeline. "Drive to the police station," they said. And so, that's exactly what I did. The car, oblivious to what I was about to do, tagged along, shadowing me like it had all night. But everything changed when I made that final turn, the one leading into the parking lot of the police station. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the car hesitated, as if surprised. Then, in a burst of urgency, it peeled away, speeding off like a bat out of hell, its taillights shrinking into dots before vanishing entirely into the night. Walking into the police station, I was a mixture of relief and lingering terror. I reported what happened. The officers took my statement, but there was a sense of futility hanging in the air. What could they really do? The car was gone, and with it, any tangible threat. Looking back, I think one of the scariest things about the entire ordeal was that it was completely unprovoked. There's no telling exactly when that car started tailing me or why. The randomness of it, the lack of a clear reason, that's what gets under your skin, makes the whole experience linger in your mind. It has definitely changed the way I view driving at night. Now, I'm always checking my mirrors, always wary of who might be behind me. The entire ordeal was nothing short of terrifying, a real-life nightmare unfolding on an otherwise ordinary night. It's an experience that I'll never forget, and one, I hope, that I'll never have to go through again.